As always, when we log in, we'll be landing on the dashboard's activity overview section. And anybody who's been in IT knows that a tool's only as good as its supporting documentation. Lucky for us, Crowdstrike has some good documentation to go along with their good tool. In order to access the documentation, you may have seen a couple of different areas in prior videos, but from anywhere, you can click on these white speech bubbles or quote marks or whatever you want to call them up here. It's highlighting blue when I mouse over it. We'll click the drop down and we'll go to the docs section. So this documentation section is broken out pretty much by type of module. And, it's pretty easy to navigate, but there is quite a lot, in here. So we'll go through some of the high-level important parts. Over here on the left, we have the Falcon sensor for Linux, Mac, and Windows. Of course, as you're installing those, this is where you'll want to jump into so you can find out for Windows what your supported Windows versions are, how to install it via either GUI or command line. If you're looking to install for Mac, this will walk you through MDM deployments, system profiles, as well as other gotchas to look out for, such as Catalina on 10.5 having its own extra additional step. And Falcon sensor for Linux is especially important because Appendix A has all of the kernel versions that are supported. Note that if you don't have a supported kernel version for Linux, you go into RFM mode, which is effectively heartbeat only. You get some visibility, but no protection, as well as some of the specific things to these. So during our Windows install, we'll talk about how Patch Tuesdays can cause a reduced functionality mode. If you want to know what reduced functionality mode on Windows looks like, you can jump in here. If you want to know what reduced functionality mode or any of the, specific command line installs for Linux are, it's in here. And do note that this is universal for all forms of Linux. You may also see information in here for modules and stuff that you as a client don't have to directly engage in. However, as always, let us know. We're here to be flexible and support you. So if you're curious about host and group management, you'll have information in here, which will talk about how groups can be managed and, some of the information about that. Down here we have dashboards and reports. So dashboards and reports are important because as we go through the onboarding process, everything we show you can generally be piped into a dashboard in one way or another. There's some default dashboards such as the first one we land on, but there's ways to customize those and change bar charts to pie charts and numbers to whichever you want. The other interesting thing is you can schedule these dashboards and reports to be sent out on your cadence. So by default, MCNC will not engage you and send you an alert for every little bit of blocked adware and, pups that are in your environment. Unless it's indicative of a wider attack or something you need to address, it doesn't make sense to notify you and say, hey, everything's good. However, if you want to know the solution's working or you're curious about your environment, you can always look at scheduled reports. MCNC can work with you to create a dashboard, such as one that would have some of the new detections, low, medium, highs, hopefully no criticals. And with that, we could have it send out, say, every Monday at 8 a.m. for your review. That'll all be performed within the console. You have some additional things you can do in here as well, such as say you're doing a massive migration from Windows 10 to Windows 11 and your leadership wants to track that. Well, you can create a report that's tracking your Crowdstrike reported information of what's Windows 10, what's Windows 11. Send that out to leadership every day. That way, that's one less manual thing you have to do. Other sections in here are such as real-time response and network containment. Real-time response is what we use to effectively get an admin remote command line to your machine. And network containment is the function in which we can restrict network access to just the Crowdstrike cloud. This is excellent for scenarios where a device is really badly compromised and you just need to directly take it offline, but you can't get direct access to it in order to power off the network card, or you may want to keep it powered on for analysis and you just want to make sure that when it powers back on, it's not going to contact a C2 server. Detection and prevention policies. These are all handled by your MCNC team, but if you're curious what we're doing, well, here you have it. Other information here that will be useful is, of course, the Falcon Spotlight is very important. That's your vulnerability management solution. So, of course, if we want to look at what vulnerabilities we have and how to navigate those systems, we'll click into there. And Falcon Discover has its own section to it. Falcon Discover is actually pretty powerful. This is all that visibility that the agent has from running on the device, such as, the host types that would go into that migration from Windows 10 to 11 dashboard I mentioned, as well as user account types, password age, login types, failed logins, installed applications. A whole vast amount of information's in here. The rest of the stuff can largely be ignored, left alone. It's all various things that we don't directly have. If you are interested in leveraging the APIs in any way, let us know. We can offer some limited support there. The APIs are open to you if you request them. Just gets to a point where there's so much you can do with those, and so many things that it could be pretty expansive. But yeah, otherwise, plenty of documentation here for you to read. Really early on, you're going to spend a lot of your time in the Falcon Sensor Deployment Guide for Windows, Mac, and Linux. Especially do review these if you have any of these types of devices in your environment, because at the forefront it'll tell you what's supported, what isn't, and if you have anything that isn't supported or is called out in those guides, you'll need to let MCNC know. Alright, so here's the next step of our documentation review. So go on ahead, make sure you're logged into the console. If you ever need to access the documentation screen, you can come up here to the little chat bubbles and click on Docs. So from within this screen, I'm going to open up the Windows section, and we're going to touch on just a few important areas here. So for Windows, the first one jumps right out. Make sure before you go installing the agent in bulk that you've reviewed which of, the supported versions you need to install to. Of course, if you're running Server 2008 R2, and of course we'll navigate down to the desktop OSs. If you have Windows 7, there's the extended support updates. If you're subscribing to those or not, you'll need to let us know. For the other versions listed here, you should be good to go. Just give the agent version a cursory glance here. Shouldn't be much issues. Unsupported versions of Windows to key in on are some of the older versions of, Windows 10 and Windows ARM, so those won't be supported. There's a bunch of information in here, such as the network requirements. So, of course, we have two URLs that we want to make sure we can access here. We access those over TLS. Try not to do any TLS interception, decryption, encryption with those if you have that in your environment. Add these two URLs to your permit list. Keep in mind we are US Gov 1, which is important because that is our FedRAMP certified cloud that we're in. And of course, the installation processes here are important. So we'll have already covered the manual install in another video. That'll be linked in the video description below. But the automatic installation here is equally as important as you're trying to do your bulk installs. The agent's pretty simple to install. When we did the command line install, we borrowed very similar command to this. Now just keep in mind, if you're using an automatic install, as long as your solution can get the agent installer out there and can run this command, you'll be pretty good to go. There are other interesting things over here, such as dealing with proxies. If you're trying to uninstall it, there is a uninstall utility you can get, or you can just do it via the control panel. If you are trying to uninstall the agent, please engage MCNC. By default, we turn on a anti-tamper, anti-uninstall password. Generally, those passwords are unique to every device themselves to prevent one user getting the password and it leaking out and compromising your entire device pool. We can set that to a uniform password if you need to do a bulk uninstall, or we can remove it entirely. There's a little bit of troubleshooting here, so generally speaking, make sure that no other installers are running when Crowdstrike is. If you have any issues, do try to give the device a reboot first. If you still have issues, you can contact us for further help. And there's also an appendix of different install parameters if you're doing an automated deployment. One thing you'll hear us talk about a bit is reduced functionality mode. So if you go ahead and you deploy Windows Patch Tuesday updates, sometimes you'll see your Windows devices go into RFM. If you're curious or you want to know a little bit more about what that is, we'll have more information for you here. So this was a quick overview of the documentation. Do keep in mind you have to be logged in to view this. However, if you need to send it to somebody who doesn't have an account or you want an offline copy for yourself, you can always do an old-fashioned screenshot of the pertinent information, highlight it, copy paste, or what I like to do is just print a PDF. All right. The documentation videos keep coming. This time we're going to be looking for Macs. So, as always, to access this screen anywhere within the Crowdstrike web console, you'll go to the upper right-hand corner to the speech bubbles, the little ones that are turning blue as I mouse over them. You'll mouse over and click, and you'll choose Docs. So within the Macs section, let's give a quick review of what's pertinent in here. Anybody familiar with managing a large amount of Macs is aware of what an MDM is. For deploying Crowdstrike to your Mac environment, we highly recommend you have an MDM that's capable of syncing system profiles, simply because the agent does need full disk access, it needs permission to run, all of that good stuff. One caveat here is if you're running Mac OS Catalina 10.15, you'll have to make sure to permit the kernel extensions. On some of the M1 hardware and newer versions of Mac, things change a bit. You also have your Falcon sensor file locations and running processes. There's a little blurb in here about some future Mac upgrades that may be needed. Really shouldn't be an issue if you're all on M1, Big Sur, or newer. And of course, here's where we touch into the MDM sync profiles. If you have an MDM, hopefully this is all pretty familiar to you. MCNC can provide some limited support with this. However, if you have any questions related to your MDM solution, we do recommend you contact that vendor and read through their documentation first, as they'll be much more knowledgeable on how to implement this. MCNC can always join a call with those vendors if it makes sense or if it helps you out, but again, we can't possibly lab up every MDM solution. Going through here, you're provided with the payload system extensions and any other necessary information needed to successfully deploy, as well as the approval for the full disk access. If you look at the Windows documentation overview, all of the supported versions are up top. Here, they're a little bit further down. Big thing to know is if it's supported by Mac, it's generally supported by Crowdstrike. This video is being recorded on March 16th of 2022, so we have till the end of December for Catalina support. Do make sure to install on those devices, but also plan to upgrade. If you've got Big Sur 11, then you're good out until 2023, and if you're running Monterey 12, you'll be good until 2024. Do take a screenshot of this, keep it in mind. Other information in here is, we want to jump to doing the alternative installation method if we don't have an MDM. So this is going to be important. If you don't have an MDM, you're going to have to go around and manually touch every device. Some MDMs are capable of deploying the agent installer itself, but they can't touch system profiles. In that scenario, you can coordinate when you push via your MDM and then you just follow up physically. Generally, what you'll have to do is permit either the system extension within the security preferences screen. If you're doing it manually, of course, you have to pass the license key. But the security and privacy screen will be pretty important because by default, when you're installing, that general screen pops up the allow. Then you'll have to go into privacy for full disk access and give agent and Falcon. All that is covered in the Mac install video. If you have any troubleshooting or any issues installing, of course, you've got these brief steps here. And then if you need anything for logs or you need to provide any troubleshooting information for us, it'll be covered here as well. So, hope that helps, and we'll see you soon. Is everybody ready for one final documentation video? So, yet again, if you're not already on the documentation screen, you can go to the quotation marks or chat bubbles up here, click on it, click Docs, you'll get to the screen. So for this, we're going to be looking at Linux this time. We'll click into Linux. And hopefully if you're a Linux admin, you're familiar with installing onto Linux. And as with, the Windows, if you need to back this up for any reason, or you need to send it to somebody who doesn't have a Crowdstrike account, you can print a PDF. However, starting at the top, right immediately we have our supported operating systems. So at a high level, this is just the default kernel that ships with it, as well as what sensor versions needed. I will note that if you have specific versions of Linux or you always stay on the latest and greatest, contact them because we can tweak your policy a bit for some of those devices. Crowdstrike on Linux is very closely tied to the kernel, so we'll have to keep that in mind. Other information to keep in mind is if you have any container or Kubernetes in your environment, as well as the same basic networking requirements. You need to be able to talk outbound TLS port 443. We are in the FedRAMP certified US Gov 1, so you'll need to permit these two URLs through if you do any TLS interception. When you install the sensor to Linux, it's pretty simple. You should ideally be familiar with what your deployment system is. It's all going to be command line here. Once you've downloaded the agent from the console and you have it on your Linux box, you can either A, run the Falcon kernel check tool, or we'll get down to the appendix where it's there. And you can just follow the commands that are appropriate for your flavor of Linux before giving it a run and a start. Looking through the side here, we have the uninstall of the Falcon sensor. So on most operating systems, we can do uninstall and anti-tamper. However, Linux has this pesky thing called root, and root does what they want. So there isn't a uninstall tamper prevention for Linux as of right now. We have further troubleshooting steps on installation or just general sensor issues, as well as if you need to open up a troubleshooting ticket with us, some information to gather so that we can expedite the review of that ticket. And most importantly, we want to look at the supported kernels. So again, we mentioned that Crowdstrike on Linux is very closely tied to the kernels, so we expressly call this out. If you're running any of these Real CentOS, Alma, Rocky 8 versions, you need to make sure you're on this specific kernel version and at least the sensor version. If you have any of the point updates, you'll go into RFM mode, and of course RFM is just a heartbeat on Linux. If we want to look at Ubuntu, again, we'll have the kernels that we have supported as well as the minimum sensor version. Again, if you install Ubuntu, you update the kernel, chances are you'll go RFM. That does lead into conversations regarding kernel vulnerabilities and other equivalent. That can be held for another call, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us to discuss that in depth. And again, if we're curious about what RFM mode is on Linux, we can go to Appendix B, and we see hosts and RFM are unprotected by Falcon. We really need to drive that home. If you're ever looking in your environment or MCNC contacts you regarding Linux devices and RFM, please set that as a top priority because those Linux devices are unprotected. There's a couple of different ways to look for it. However, just your host management, turn on the RFM column and sort by that. And then, of course, a little bit of information regarding the Falcon kernel check tool. Hopefully this was a good brief overview of the Linux documentation, and reach out to us if you have any questions. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to share it out with folks in your cohort or anybody you think it could be useful to. We're all in this migration journey together. And always remember, if you have any questions, we're here to help, and you know how to get a hold of us.